Great. A warm welcome back to those audience members who joined us this morning's GovTech event, and to those audience members worldwide joining us now. We're happy to host the first in a three-part series called From the Lab to the Field, where we discuss the latest in tax administration research and how it can inform those tax officials working in the field. Joining us today is Ms. Giulia Mascani. Giulia is Research Director of the International Center for Taxation and Development, ICTD, and Research Fellow at the Institute for Development Studies, IDS. She is a development economist holding a PhD in economics from the University of Sussex and specializing in public finance in low-income countries. For over 10 years, she has been engaged in research and policy advisory work, primarily in Ethiopia and Rwanda. Her main area of research is taxation in low-income countries, with a particular focus on the evaluation of tax administration practices and tax policies. She also has broader research interests in public finance, evaluation of public policy, and effectiveness. She is also a research advisor to the Rwanda Revenue Authority, member of TDAT's Technical Advisory Group, adjunct professor at Johns Hopkins University, IIS Europe, and research associate of the Institute of Fiscal Studies, UK. Welcome to the podcast, Giulia.
Thank you very much.
Our second guest is Mr. Michael Keane. Mick is Cruciota Fellow, Tokyo College, University of Tokyo, and Research Associate of CERDI, Université Clermont-Auvergne, Institute of Fiscal Studies, London Centre for Business Taxation, Oxford. Before retiring from the IMF as Deputy Director of the Fiscal Affairs Department at the International Monetary Fund, Mick was the TDAT line manager and is now currently a member of the Technical Advisory Group. Welcome to the podcast, Mick.
Nice to be back. Never escaped TDAT.
Never. So my first question for today, I'll start with you, Giulia. You've written a review article on tax compliance titled From the Lab to the Field, which we borrowed for today's title. It's a review of tax experiments. What is that about?
Thank you very much for that question. And thanks again for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here with you and Mick today. So the review is about tax experiments, as the title says. And tax experiments are about identifying the impact of policy or administrative measures on tax compliance in a rigorous way. So they very much borrow the idea of treatment and group from medical trials. And I think we all got quite used to hearing about those medical trials recently. What scientists typically do in those, they have a group of people who signed up for the trial. They divide them into groups, and they will want to make sure that the two groups are quite comparable in terms of, the age structure, medical history, gender balance. And then they will give to one group, the treatment group, the vaccine, for example, and to the other group, they will give nothing or sort of placebo vaccine. And what they will do is they will compare the outcomes in the two groups and check if the group of the vaccine is perhaps less likely to get the disease, or perhaps if they get the disease, maybe they are more likely to get a less severe version of it. So that is very much the idea, and you might be wondering, how do you translate that in tax? So in the lab, here's how it works. So you normally have a room at a university where researchers set up a game-like exercise. And the participants are usually students, and the game has got a theme. So the researchers can set up all the parameters. You will have given tax rate, you will have a certain amount of sanctions, the probability to get caught, and every participant will have assigned to them a certain amount of income, fictional income. As they will play various rounds of this game, they will decide how much to declare to the fictional revenue authority. And as they go on with the rounds, researchers can change the parameters. So for example, the researchers can decide in one group, they will increase the tax rate, in the other group, they will keep it the same, and then they will check if that increase in the tax rate led to any change in the decision of participants on how much income to report to the fictional tax authority. So this is again the idea of treatment and control group from medical trial. And I now gave you an example on tax rates, but you can do the same with rewards for good taxpayers, public shame for evasion, all sorts of things. So these lab experiments are great to test theories because you can actually control every bit of the environment in a way that you cannot do in real life. It would be impossible in the real world to change the tax rate for one group or another. It would be completely unacceptable. But I think one open question is how does the behavior that we observe in the lab translate into the real world where actions have real consequences, and in particular, evasion has a real consequence there. So that research moved to the field. And how does a tax experiment look like in the field? I'll try to illustrate that with from Rwanda. This is a study that I led a few years back there. So this was 2016, and we partnered with the Rwanda Revenue Authority. Around the time when taxpayers were required to declare for their income taxes, the Revenue Authority sent out messages to 9,000 taxpayers. And those messages were of three kinds. One was a simple reminder of deadlines. The second one was a message reminding them of sanctions. And the third one was a message linking tax payments to for public services. So we set this up as an experiment in the sense that we have one control group that received no message and treatment groups, one for each one of the type of messages that I just mentioned. So what happened? Did compliance increase as a result of those messages? Well, quite a bit. Some of those messages were quite effective. The reminder in particular increased tax compliance, tax paid actually by over 50% compared to the control group that received no message. And overall, all these messages resulted in $6 million extra revenue for the Revenue Authority. And that is compared to a cost for sending messages well below $4,000. So a pretty good cost-benefit ratio there. The important thing to say is that the end of communication is something that the Revenue Authority normally does, and not only in Rwanda, but in many other countries. In fact, the messages went out through normal channels that the RRA, the Rwanda Revenue Authority, uses to communicate with taxpayers. And as far as taxpayers were concerned, this was a normal communication, a normal interaction with the Revenue Authority. We as researchers simply come in to set up the experiment in a way that could be rigorously evaluated. And of course, we did the evaluation later, and we showed that it was quite effective. And after that, the Rwanda Revenue Authority used those kind of messages a lot more aggressively and systematically in their communications with taxpayers. So when we think about moving from the lab to the field in terms of compliance research, there's really three elements to it. The first one is this close collaboration between researchers and tax administrators. The second one is about observing real compliance behavior in real life. And the third one is about using administrative data that already exists in tax administrations. So tax officials in their job of collecting taxes collect all sorts of information, primarily from tax declarations, and that information can be used to evaluate the impact of messages, like in this example I just gave, a tax experiment, but also lots of other administrative measures or even tax policy changes. Those administrative can be really useful in evaluating these things. So this is what moving from the lab to the field means for tax compliance research. That was clear.
Indeed, Julia, thank you very much. So Mick, what is your take on this research?
Well, I guess the one word answer is I think it's great. And I should probably say a bit more than that. But before I do that, let me kind of just recommend Julia's survey article. I think you mentioned on it. So I think if you just Google Julia's name and lab to the field, it should turn up. It's all open access. No equations, as far as I remember. Very, very readable. Great account. So why is it great? I think probably great in two ways. It's great kind of in itself because this line of research and these methods more generally are really kind of bringing to tax analysis very much cutting edge techniques. These are, and some of the techniques we'll talk about in a minute, I hope, are kind of what the Nobel Prize in Economics was given for, was using these kind of methods to think about or evaluate policy. So I think, our subject benefits very much from in itself, just in terms of the rigor and the insights of the results that emerge from it. It's great for the topic itself. It really, I think, transformed the research agenda. I think it's also a side benefit has been that I think these methods have actually attracted to the area, both the compliance literature more generally, bright young researchers, because they can work in this area and hope to get good publications in great journals, which is kind of what drives the profession. So it's been a way, I think, of attracting some great talent into the area, and a lot of amazing sort of creativity that experiments like the one Julia describes have shown. It's been really very impressive. Bright young talent attracted to the area. So it reminds me, a few years ago, I wrote a kind of a piece called Tax and Development Again, which was slightly pessimistic about the interest academics take. And I think that's, I'm happy to have been proved wrong, at least for this short period. I'm not sure one issue is how long that'll go on, but anyway, great is the bottom line. In fact, I think it's probably even greater than potential and realization to some extent, even greater than the kind of the control, the kind of lab type experience it describes. Because there's also a lot of interest in what are called natural experiments. And these natural experiments, as the name might suggest, these are things where there's some policy change that is interesting and affects different groups differently. Ideally affects one group of people or one group of firms, doesn't affect another group. So nature has sort of created something a bit like the treatment group that's affected by the reform, the control group that isn't. And then by comparing what happens in the two groups, you can try to infer something about the impact of the reform itself. Of course, it's much more difficult when you're not randomizing in the same way, when you're not actually controlling as precisely as in an experiment. But these are the techniques that, if you figure it out, get you a Nobel Prize for working it out. An example, maybe just to give a quick example, was we did some work years ago looking at the what's called the flat tax reform in Russia, which was a prime feature, which was a big cut in top rates of tax, came down from like 30 to 13, so a big cut. And what happened was the tax revenue went up hugely after this reform. So people tended to think, well, clearly it was the flat tax reform that did it. But in fact, we took a closer look at it because the idea being that, well, there was one group that was very much affected by this 30%. There was another group of society that really faced no change at all. The basic rate moved from 12 to 13. So nothing really happened. So you could then ask, well, do we see big differences between the two groups, the ones directly affected, the ones not affected, in the hours they work, or any kind of indication of incentive effects? And the answer turns out to be no. That is, the changes for the two groups were much the same over the 2 years. But what did seem to happen was a big difference by looking at the consumption data. There were big changes in the proportion of consumption that was actually translated into income. So you could infer something about compliance. So that wasn't a controlled experiment in the same sense, but nevertheless was a helpful insight. So I think it's all great. Maybe I should say raise a couple of issues or the challenges in the area. And one is what's called external validity. And this is the question, well, okay, your experiment has shown that something worked in some particular situation, but how do we know that it'll work in some other different situation, in some other country, in some other environment, in some other state of the business cycle, in some other time of the year, whatever it is. So this has been, I think, in some sense, it's inherent in experiments, right? Because experiments show you what works, but they don't necessarily show you why it works. And in some sense, you need to know why it works in order to extend it to other contexts. I think this is something where clearly the most careful researchers, like Julia, are very clear about the limits of what you can conclude. Probably hasn't always been the case in the literature. But I think in some sense, the methods are also emerging to be a bit more careful about it. Maybe another issue to raise is, and again, I think this is changing, but the question of whether when you take the kind of the gold standard to be a controlled experiment of this kind, whether we end up looking at is relatively small interventions, cheap, small interventions. You know, at the back of our mind is always, you know, if we think about the sustainable goals, many of the countries we're talking about need somewhere to get, according to the IMF estimates, another 15 points of GDP. Somewhere or other, we're looking for big numbers from this. And I think we have to kind of, an important question in all these, which I think people do ask more now, and Julie just did very nicely with her experiment. You know, it hasn't always been the case that people have asked, well, this is really important. There may be a nice statistically significant effect. It may be a very nicely done experiment, you can publish in a great journal. But at the end of the day, how much revenue is in this? And there are certainly some well-known studies that the revenue is not really, it's not going to take us very far. So I think these things are changing, but I think there are the issues about the external validity, focusing on important things. Maybe we'll have more of a opportunity to discuss. I think this is kind of changing, but I think it also is a reminder that, you know, there are other techniques we have to use to think about, in particular, some of the big questions. There are some things, as Julia says, we're never going to get experimental evidence. We have to have theories. We have use of not so clean empirical evidence, but sorry, that was a long way of elaborating on the single word. But back to you, Annette.
Thank you so much, Mick. So it seems research is more directly real and practical. Julia, what new insights did we get from your studies?
So yes, a lot more directly real research. Some of the insights are really quite expected, particularly, for example, on enforcement. You know, this research has shown that, for example, messages that highlight sanctions to taxpayers work well to improve compliance when tax administrators adopt technological tools to make underreporting harder for taxpayers, that kind of. So that is not very surprising, but there are also some more unexpected insights, and I'm going to give you two examples of that. The first one is again related to the Rwanda experiment. So yes, we did find that deterrence messages help increase compliance for the majority of taxpayers, especially smaller ones. But for larger taxpayers, it looks like they actually backfire. And this is a result that was found elsewhere in Israel and the US as well. It is particularly important for low-income countries because in these countries, you have a very high concentration of revenue amongst a few large taxpayers. And anything the tax administration does with those large taxpayers matters a lot in terms of tax revenue. So if a message like that will backfire with large taxpayers, it's certainly something that needs to be taken into consideration quite carefully. The other example is about electronic billing machines. And we did a study on this in Ethiopia with my colleagues Andwele Mengistu and Firewolde. So we evaluated whether those billing machines were actually helpful to increase compliance. And again, as expected, they improved firm reporting on sales, which is what they're meant to do. But those firms actually have multiple ways to respond to those administrative changes. So what they did is, yes, they increased sales, but they also increased costs much more proportionally than sales. So tax payments increased, but a lot less proportionally compared to sales. So again, this speaks to, you know, a bit more unexpected and nuanced results. I think another important insight that this more practical research allowed us to uncover is about taxpayer knowledge. And this is something that I've been particularly passionate about in the last 2 or 3 years. I was really surprised to learn that almost 40% of new taxpayers in Rwanda don't know what type they are registered for. And these are taxpayers who just registered for tax a few weeks or a few months before responding to this question. And this weak knowledge is not only a fact per se, it's actually related do compliance. So the majority of those new taxpayers fails to submit a tax return in the first year after registering. And what we can see from data is that once new taxpayers don't file in the first year after registering, they're quite unlikely to ever file again. So I was thinking, how do we solve this issue that seems quite significant? And we did some research on taxpayer education in Rwanda. And by I mean myself and my colleagues Fabrizio Santoro and Dennis Mukama from the Rwanda Revenue Authority. So what we found there is that providing new taxpayers with a half-day training actually increased the probability to submit a declaration by at least 20%, which is quite big. And some of our estimates are actually also a lot larger than that. So this is just one example, but there's lots of new insights on compliance costs and taxpayer confusion with complex tax systems. And in fact, speaking to Mix about RCTs, randomized trials not being the only method here, in this case we actually couldn't randomize because the Rwanda Revenue Authority was very clear that they wanted to keep the training open to all new taxpayers. They didn't want us to say this group will have the training, this group won't. So we had to get a bit creative, and we tried to keep the similar spirit of collaboration using administrative data, observing real behavior, but adopting other methods that were, I think, similarly rigorous, but certainly not randomized. So, I mean, I agree very much with you, Mick, that we should focus on the questions rather than specific interventions or specific methods. And sort of in that spirit, I'd be really interested in hearing from you. When you think about that broader research and broader set of questions, what are the main lessons that you take from it?
Yes, well, I think I suppose you kind of asked the right question a moment ago, because I think when I read these things, I guess I always think, what would surprise the TEDx team, or what would surprise all these experienced tax administrators in these results, because tax administration's been plodding away at these issues for kind of thousands of years and sort of built up some knowledge and at least folk wisdom. So kind of what would surprise them? And I think you're right that some results, I guess, in the early stages felt a bit like this thing about Columbus discovers America, when it was there all the time. So some of the work on withholding, again, it's great, and it's great to know how important withholding can be. But tax administration's been doing that since, I think, 1512 is supposed to be the earliest example of withholding. So I think we have to. We have to be a little bit modest on some of these studies, at least in terms of what's actually new. Of course, it's all very good to validate what people already think, but nonetheless, as in all research, we have to be a bit modest sometimes about what we in our academic roles discover. But having said that, I mean, I think there are some things that surprise me, at least, and I think thinking about it more as well, I think these are all examples that, like the one you mentioned, where somehow you sense the generalizable results. These have the feel of things. Well, I can think of a kind of a theory explanation of these things that I believe. So maybe just to go through, if I have time, just kind of 3 examples. I think one is exactly the one you mentioned. I think the point about how you kind of may improve information control on one margin, people will start to manipulate on another one. You're not monitoring so closely. I think that's in some sense not surprising in itself, but the magnitude and the cleverness of taxpayers is also interesting, because of course taxpayers have been avoiding it for thousands of years as well, so they can be pretty good at the game. Another one that struck me particularly, and you talk about in your survey, is kind of an experiment that's done in Pakistan on the incentive systems for tax officials, where historically a lot of probably the dominant way that taxes have been collected has been through some form of tax farming, where you give very direct revenue incentives to the people doing business to actually go out and collect the money. And of course, that, since the French Revolution, has had kind of quite a bad name. But nonetheless, there are these big issues about how do you incentivize tax officials to work non-corruptly and efficiently. So this experiment looked at various ways of rewarding inspectors, and one of which, to one of the treatment groups, is essentially was a cut, quite a large cut, on the revenue they actually collected. And I suppose what was interesting, and another one, if I remember correctly, was just a kind of standard kind of performance appraisal system of the kind that probably all our organizations have. And my recollection is that the monetary incentive had a big effect. The kind of standard performance assessment didn't do anything, basically. But an interesting point was that apparently taxpayer satisfaction didn't change all that much. So taxpayers didn't particularly hate this new system, but it raised additional revenue. So I kind of liked that one because it was kind of innovative, creative, and I think it opens up all sorts of possibilities in an important sort of under-touched area, which is, I think, all these HR issues for revenue administration. Another one the last one I'd highlight was one of the early ones, and I think still a classic, was Dina Pomerantz paper on VAT compliance, using basically which was a very well, cleverly designed experiment to try to capture the kind of spillover effects that we all believe, we all write, VAT systems should have. But it was a well-designed experiment to see how the kind of enforcement transmits along the chain in VAT systems, and very nicely done. But the thing that was counterintuitive to me was that the bottom line, as I recall and understand, was that the way to improve compliance in a VAT chain was to start at the end, was to start at retailers and work backwards. Whereas my intuition, and I would say probably the conventional, has always been that you start at the beginning with the larger taxpayers at import stage, and compliance kind of moves forward. Whereas this was suggesting that, well, you move back. So that was an example of something that I guess really kind of has made me think again about some of the things I thought I believed about the VAT. So those are ones particularly in my mind, but I think maybe it'd be interesting to hear more about one of the things you mentioned, Julie, was the role of complexity and lack of knowledge, I guess, of taxpayers. You could say a bit more about that, and what you think tax administrators might be struck by in those results.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, as you said before, Mick, I think there is a sense that probably most tax administrators will have that taxpayer knowledge is a problem. And I think we all have experiences with talking to family members, friends, colleagues who are not tax experts. And I think we all get a sense of the kind of knowledge that is out there, and also the frustration that is out there with the tax system. I think that's what at least I hear a lot when I speak to family. But I think maybe it might actually be surprising to tax administrators to both realize the extent of the problem and the implications of it. So in terms of the extent of the problem, we actually did a small tax quiz in Rwanda, and it was actually a lot of fun to do that with taxpayers. We also tested it on some of our colleagues from the Revenue Authority, and we had 20 basic questions about tax, and this was for new taxpayers. The typical taxpayer only got 30% of them right. So you might think, these are new taxpayers, they don't yet know much about the tax system. But then we repeated that for a nationally representative survey, so a very similar quiz about tax knowledge. And these are now not only new taxpayers, but all taxpayers, all kinds of taxpayers. Again, the results were very similar on tax knowledge. They knew very little about the tax system. And just to give you a sense, the kind of questions we asked are, for example, do you know the deadline for for submitting your declaration? And only 40% knew what the deadline is. Or, do you know what is the tax rate for income taxes or for VAT? And it's only a minority who were actually able to respond to those questions. And this is not about Rwanda. We had similar results from Eswatini, and also there are cross-country studies showing very similar weak knowledge. So maybe the extent will be surprising. Perhaps more surprising are the implications. I already spoke about the implications on compliance and particularly non-filing. So addressing the issue of knowledge can actually improve the ability of filing, but also it can improve equity. And I'll give you one example from a recent study we did on VAT. And here we, Roald Dom, Fabrizio Santoro, and myself, again, looking at administrative data from Rwanda, we found it was I think, surprising to us that small taxpayers actually have a higher effective tax burden from the VAT than larger ones. And as we looked a bit more carefully into the data, we realized that the main reason is that they often fail to claim for their inputs. So by doing that, they effectively leave money on the table and they end up paying more in VAT. So the VAT rate is the same for everyone, but the way small taxpayers engage with the VAT system results in them paying a bit more, sometimes quite a bit more. And we went out and talked to taxpayers and tried to figure out why is that happening. We did focus group discussions, and the main explanation, or one of the main explanations, is related exactly to taxpayer confusion and compliance costs. Again, this is not a finding specific about Rwanda. I'm working with other academics to actually produce similar results across a wider range of countries, and our preliminary results actually show that the same holds across different countries. But also it is not specific about the VAT. So we found similar results in corporate income tax, both in Ethiopia and South Africa, where there was a higher tax burden for small firms, which is associated with fewer claims for business expenses. So again, I don't know if this is surprising, but there is certainly a lot of scope to understand taxpayer knowledge better and its implications on real, taxpayer life, their burden, their relation with the tax administration. And this is an issue that really affects so many different administrative processes. And one of them is registration, which we won't talk about today, but maybe in the next episode, we can pick up on that.
Thanks very much, Julia. Mick, you mentioned tax administrators have been learning about their job for centuries, and I'm sure you won't mind me mentioning your recent book with Joel Slimrod, Rebellion, Rascals, and Revenue. Are there any lessons from history there on how to build compliance?
Oh, thanks, man. No, I don't mind you mentioning it at all. In fact, I'm very happy that you did. Yeah, there are lots of lessons, and we have lots of stories in the book. Of course, as Julie mentioned, deterrence has been the main feature of tax administration for thousands of years. There are kind of wall paintings in ancient Egypt of tax evaders being whipped, and so the book has plenty of stories about the activity of tax administrations in designing deterrence methods, some of which are kind of just completely outrageous and even too appalling for us to even put in the book. But short of that, I think the prize goes to the governor of Bengal in Mughal India, who apparently one of the punishments for evading taxes was to force to wear leather trousers and have cats put inside these leather trousers. So I don't know if we've done any experiments on the effects of cats down trousers for tax compliance, but I don't know. That's one. There are lessons, some nice lessons about how sometimes quite simple things can have big effects, a little bit as one of our themes. The story we use on that is a gentleman, I never know how to pronounce it, John Shilagi, who was an IRS, worked in the IRS in the United States in the 80s. And he noticed when people were filling in their forms and claiming dependents, they sometimes seemed to be multiplying the number of dependents, even claiming pets as dependents. So there was a tax return where somebody called Fluffy was claimed to be a dependent to get the allowance. And so John, I'll just call him John, said, well, why don't we require that if you're going to claim a dependent, you have to give their social security number. So this was put onto the form. And the next year, the number of dependents went up by 7 million and revenue went up by about 40 billion. And it's a nice story, except that poor old John then claimed some reward for this massive innovation. He had much trouble getting it. But in the end, he got $25,000 as his reward for saving the government or obtaining for the government another $40 billion. So, you may not get big thanks if you do invent great ways to improve compliance. The last one is one of the ones I most like, which brings out some of the links with policy, compliance and policy, and how bad policy can promote non-compliance, which was, many countries have had taxes on bachelors for very, probably pretty good reasons. But what happened in Argentina had a bachelor tax, and in about the 20th century, somebody making tax policy in Argentina apparently decided that if you were a man and you had proposed to a lady and she had turned you down, said, no, I'm not going to marry you, you could get a tax exemption from the bachelor tax if she signed the proper form saying that you proposed to her. So, of course, what happened, so well-intentioned policy, very careful about these poor love-struck men. But what happened, of course, was there emerged what were called professional lady refusers, sorry, who for a small fee would sign a form saying that you had proposed to marry them and they had turned you down. So this, of course, then becomes a compliance problem because of the bad policy. So those are some of the more fun stories. There are kind of more serious ones. We talk about the emergence of withholding, how, for example, the people always think of the income tax beginning with Pitt, the younger, 1799. That one was a bit of a failure. It was the reintroduction by the less famous Addington in 1804 that was a success. And what was the difference between them? The difference was that the 1804 version had withholding, which were so essentially double the revenue at the same rate. Wasn't a kind of any kind of controlled or even natural experiment, but I think tells us about withholding. So I could go on with more stories, but yes, I think history does have a lot of lessons for us.
Thank you very much, Meg. Very, very interesting and entertaining indeed. I'd like to mention that Julia's research, as well as a link to Meg's book, is found in the summary box of YouTube right below this video. So we welcome you to and peruse over the research and to find entertaining stories on tax follies over the centuries. So Julia, as Meg says, tax administrators have a wealth of experience and history to learn from. How can researchers?
Yeah, so I mean, the first thing to say is that we as researchers have certainly a lot to learn from those experiences, and it's great that Mick actually wrote a book about it, so we can start from there, but it certainly doesn't end then. But how can research help here? Well, I can think about at least 3 ways. One is, we talked a lot about analysis, so I think this is one way in which research can help. Tax administrators are not always or able to put the effort needed to do this kind of analysis, and partnering up with researchers allows them to have a better sense of what works and what does not in terms of actual impact. And this is particularly important in revenue administrations that are constrained in terms of the resources they have, which is, I guess, every tax administration in the world, but maybe particularly the one in low-income countries. So the first one is rigorous analysis to know what works, what does not. Another way that research can help, I guess, is about blind spots. So researchers can sometimes shed light on things that tax administrators might not naturally pay attention to. And the example I gave before about missed input claims for VAT is a good example, because here, there is no revenue gain from solving this problem. And it is very normal for tax administrators not to focus on this, because their job is increase revenue, and for good reasons, especially in low-income countries. But it doesn't mean that it isn't important for researchers to point to it. And the reason is that when you can improve equity, in this case of the VAT or of the system more generally, you are probably affecting the willingness of taxpayers to pay their taxes. You're probably reducing their frustration with the tax system. And that will improve compliance, tax morale, and probably not immediately, but in the longer term, it might even increase revenue. So that is the second way research can help. The third way is about those collaborations between researchers and tax administrators. And the value of those collaborations goes really well beyond the results of a specific evaluation. There's a lot of learning that happens in the process of working together. And again, just one example, but there's so many more. in the process of running the tax experiment in Rwanda, we really wanted to have messages that contain taxpayer names, because we know from behavioral research that having your name when you receive a message from the tax authority is very different than receiving an anonymous message that just says, dear taxpayer. So the RRA, the Rwanda Revenue Authority, had to develop a new platform to personalize SMS to include taxpayers' names. And they ended up creating that platform in the context of the experiment and using it ever since. There's many more examples, but these are things that do not necessarily go in the final paper or in the final study, but that happen in the process of collaborating. So I would really like to encourage any tax administrators who are listening to look out for these collaborations, invest in them. They're not guaranteed to work, they're not easy, but when they do, they hold huge potential for everyone.
Thank you so much, Julia. Indeed, collaboration is always fruitful. So Mick, how would you like to see this line of research developing?
Well, I think it's in a pretty healthy state. The important thing is that it does continue, and it continues to attract great researchers, and fully endorse what Julie was saying about encouraging revenue administrations to become involved in this, and even the idea to be a kind of proactive effort too, where some of these natural experiments, it's not always obvious to outsiders that something is a good experiment. It may be, as we promote the idea, I think that may become easier for people to spot these kind of opportunities for analysis, and to play around with the policy initiative a little bit to facilitate those innovations. So I hope it carries on. It seems to me, ideally, ambition would increase, and a lot of coming back to the theme of looking ultimately for quite big revenue increases. A lot of the big reforms we think about are really major changes in institutions, in policies, some of which don't lend themselves so much to lab experiment, maybe sometimes to natural experiments. As Julia says, I think, I think a lot of, as well as administration to some extent lends itself to these experiments, because there aren't any necessarily great constitutional political objections to these experiments. In other contexts, there may be. But nonetheless, I think that's an area in which we can be a little bit more creative, identify opportunities for thinking out some big reforms. There's work, for example, that looks at the effects of creation of semi-independent revenue authorities, a little bit along this natural experiment line I was talking about, all kinds of difficulties, but I think those are things that it's going to be very helpful to address. Bigger issues about things like, well, often a VAT has been proposed, and in part because we think the VAT can help on income tax compliance. There are issues there, I think, to think about. But there are all kinds of, for me, there are all kinds of policy issues that we know very little about. Things like, who really bears the burden of VAT rate changes? So if you have a reduced rate of VAT, does that necessarily mean that the people buying the low-rated goods benefit, or does the benefit go to producers? These are all kind of key questions. Maybe to some extent, we can think about using carefully designed experiments, natural and otherwise, to address them. But as Julia says, at some point, these are questions that we shouldn't ignore these questions. We have to have the best brain about these questions as well, even if they're kind of, in methodology terms, going to be much dirtier questions. And I think, as Julia was mentioning from her row, you have to show creativity and use whatever methods you to bear that you can. So I think the bottom line, we mustn't shy away from some of the harder questions in our area. And these methods could be so beautiful that maybe sometimes we want to make sure our best and brightest focus on the big questions as well. And that leads me also to put in a word for theory. Think about things in a theoretical sense, because become rather unfashionable. But again, coming back to these issues of external validity and so on, here is what's kind of needed, I think, to think about ultimately generalizing some of these results. But I hope it carries on, goes from strength to strength, and most important, I think, that it continues to attract such great people as Julia to the area, because you know, tax hasn't been the most fashionable area for bright young people to go into. And we need to make sure that it becomes an area that affects them. So that would be it from me. But yeah, let's hear from Julia. I think Julia's the one we should hear from on this one.
Well, I'm not going to repeat what you said, but I do want to say that I agree very much on what you said about questions, and yes, using the best methods when we can, but you know, not fix too much on those. Focus more on the big questions. Well, if I think about sort of the direction of this research agenda on tax compliance, well, on tax experiments, I think there's one thing that I see as a particular gap, and it is this, that you know, tax have shown that those messages can provide an immediate nudge, which can be quite effective in increasing compliance. But what happens next year and what happens after that is that increasing compliance sustained. Most tax experiments don't even ask this question. The ones that do find no effect even in the second year after the intervention. So I actually asked myself this, and I had this question asked to me a lot. So what should we do? You know, should we keep sending those messages every year? And then I asked myself, you know, but the tax administration send those messages every year, and every year, me as a taxpayer, I receive a threat or you know, a reminder that there are things out there, but actually nothing happens to me ever, and I keep evading. What does it do to the credibility of the tax administration? So we don't have answers really to those questions, I think, yet, not from the tax experiments literature. And maybe that's not where we should look for answers. Maybe, as you said, Mick, you know, look more broadly. And one of, I think, these ways of broadening this up is to look at interventions that are actually geared to generating learning as opposed to just nudging. And taxpayer education is one of those things. I would like to see a lot more research on that. And actually, it's quite. I was really surprised to see how much revenue administrations, at least in the African continent, but worldwide, are doing on tax education. So there are soap operas on tax, there are radio programs, there's all sorts of things. There are bands going around the country, you know, really bringing tax knowledge to taxpayers. It's full of these things, and we know pretty much nothing about whether they work or not. There's a lot of potential there. But then if I think about a broader agenda for future compliance research, there would be, I think, 3 things at the top of my list. The first one is, how can we make sure we tax the wealthy more effectively in low-income countries? And we heard a lot about this recently. Just this week, there was the UN Tax Committee, which discussed the issue of wealth taxes and solidarity taxes specifically. The IMF and the World Bank had a conference about it last week. But I don't think we know enough about how to do that actually in low-income countries. But I think it would be important, not only because it is important that everybody pays their fair share, but also for equity more generally and for compliance. I think when governments send a clear signal on equity, that helps compliance more. And we just this morning published a blog about it. So if you want to know how we at the ICTD collectively think about it, I'm sorry, I'm going to do a little bit of promotion here, but there is a blog that hopefully it is in the chat box. The second area is technology and digitized data. So there's been quite a revolution in tax administration in the last couple of decades. But how, we don't know yet about how is that technology and data actually used to contribute to effective, efficient, equitable tax administration. There's a lot more to do to figure out how to make the most out of it. And the third element of that research agenda would be on tax officials. So you mentioned before the research on tax officials' performance. I really like that research, it's great. I think there is not enough that we know about what is the role of taxpayer officials in shaping taxpayer compliance and revenue generation as a result, including their attitudes and behavior in the interaction with taxpayers. And oftentimes those interactions are, where taxpayers and citizens form their views on government more generally. So I think it is an important thing to focus on going forward.
Thank you so much, Julia and Mick. At this time, unfortunately, we're running out of time. And I'd like to open up the floor to questions from our audience. If I could hand over the floor to Wafai to ask the first question, please.
Yes, thank you, Annette. Thank you, Julia and Mick, for that very insightful conversation. We have questions from our audience. I think there may be too many to answer because of time constraints. The first one goes to Julia. It says, in the experiments in Rwanda, were there any parallel enforcement actions going on? And if so, what influence were these other parallel actions on the field results?
So in the case of Rwanda, there wasn't anything particular going on at the same time. Also, what we were doing in that experiment was sending out messages at a very specific time. So it was over 1 or 2 months just before the declaration deadline. So at that time, there was nothing going on. Over the year, of course, there were other things going on, but that wouldn't affect the evaluation because whatever happened more broadly in the country affected everyone. Whereas we were able to set up the experiment between control group and groups so that everyone might have been affected by something else going on in the country, but we still have those differences in treatment and control group that allow us to measure impact. But yes, I'm not aware of anything in the case of Rwanda. This question reminds me that in the case of Ethiopia instead, which might be useful to mention here, when we were evaluating electronic billing machines, there was actually something else going on at the same time, which is that because those electronic billing machines were generating lots of new data for the Revenue Authority, and because they were representing a very easy way for the Revenue Authority to check if you were compliant or not. So they might not be able to see if you were reporting all your income, but they were able to see if you had a machine and if it was switched on and if you were using it. So that very visible thing about compliance actually allowed the Revenue Authority to push for quite a few high-profile cases, in some cases leading to imprisonment of very well-known business people in Ethiopia, in particular, is the capital. So that enforcement push that came with the introduction of the machines is certainly one reason why there was such a big impact. We found a very big impact of those machines.
Thank you, Julia. Thank you so much. Off to my colleague, Vanessa, for the next question.
Yes, thank you, Annette. Thank Mike and Julia for your insights. My question goes to Mike. What policy responses, other than administration, made following the Rwanda compliance research? Oh, excuse me. Actually, how does all of these relate to the TADAD framework? And what can the TADAD itself learn from this research, Mike?
Thanks so much. I think the first question, maybe related to the Rwanda study, if I caught it. So that might be one for,
yes, that goes
might be
to
one
Julia.
for Julia. Yeah. Do you want to say something about that, Julia? I'm not thinking to that one.
I was going to let you go ahead with that one. But if you want, I can speak to the Rwanda experiment.
Well, to that, I mean, the question I suppose is, and it's a general question, I suppose, for a lot of TA evaluation. I mean, you could say, you could find a way, so you can look at, you look at changes in TADAT scores as some indicator of a change in performance. Ideally what you'd like is a set of exactly the same countries that didn't have a TADAT and look at how the experience across the two differed. Of course, you don't have that, but there are methods for trying to kind of artificially create comparator groups to the ones that did experience the TADAT assessment. And I guess you can then look for differences in some variables that may be of interest, other than, I guess, TADAT scores. I don't know, measure of revenue performance or C efficiency or something. So I don't have a quick answer, but I think if one can find, we'd have to find a way of constructing a natural experiment to build around the assessment, which would be, in principle, an implication of the effectiveness of a TADAT assessment. But yeah, that would be the best I could come up with on that one, I think. But I didn't know the other part was about Rwanda and policy changes or something.
Right, Chris, could you ask the question again for Julia, please?
Of course. Julia, just to reiterate the question for you, it's what policy responses rather than administration when following the Rwanda compliance research?
So if by policy we mean anything to do with sort of tax rates, that kind of stuff, the answer is none, because it was mostly about really communicating with taxpayers. I think in terms of the tax administration, it changed. So after that experiment, the Revenue Authority used those messages a lot more systematically, and particularly SMS. So I think the thing I haven't said at the beginning, a lot of this literature uses physical letters, but that is not very relevant to low-income countries where often you don't really have, proper addresses. Anyway, it's not very easy to find people at a physical address. So we experimented a bit also with email, SMS, and we found that text messages were actually amongst the most effective delivery method. Something that the Revenue Authority has been doing a lot more of, and more systematically around the declaration timeline. But they have also adopted the same method for other things. For example, you only declare once a year, but you pay your taxes 4 times a year. So around the time of paying taxes, they can also find taxpayers about their payments in that way. Something else is perhaps a bit more abstract, but I'm going to take that risk, is, one of the things that we found is that friendly messages were particularly effective to encourage compliance. And these are friendly reminders or even messages highlighting the relation to public services, but particularly friendly reminders. So that in many ways sort of validated what a lot of tax administrators already know, that of course they need enforcement, but actually equally important is the customer orientation and making sure taxpayers are supported in their compliance, and that relationship is not only or necessarily antagonistic. So yes, enforcement I think remains the cornerstone of tax administration, but I think everything else is a bit more than a soft addition. It's really central to a modern approach to tax administration, and I think that experiment nicely validated that. I don't think the Rwanda Revenue Authority didn't know that before. I think they were already well aware of that, but it's nice to see that in a rigorous study.
Excellent, thank you so much. And I'd like to give the floor once again to my colleague Chris for another question that's come in from our audience.
Yes, so there's another question for you, Julia. So was there any observation on follow-up whether the initial results, improvement in compliance, were sustained or sustainable, bearing in mind that there are many dimensions that impact compliance behavior?
Yeah, so actually we did look at year 2 after the implementation of the messaging experiment, and we found that the effects weren't there anymore. So while in the first year, right after the experiment, there was a difference between the control group, in year 2, there was no difference anymore. So if there was a compliance gain, it was sort of eroded in the following year. But I should also say that at the time when we implemented this, the Rwanda Revenue Authority wasn't using these kind of messages very often with taxpayers, but after the study, they started using them a lot more extensively. So it is quite possible that, as I said before, once you start using those messages a lot, actually their effectiveness might also increase. So the evaluation of the second year is a lot more messy than the evaluation of the first year. But yeah, on the taxpayer education, we also looked at the second year, and there we could actually see a sustained effect. And I'm not very surprised by that, because, is a nudge. It's going to nudge you immediately, but it's not necessarily going to, it actually doesn't even have the objective of teaching or getting taxpayers to learn anything. So it is actually natural that they have a short-lived effect. And the other studies that I know of, there's only really 2 that look at longer-term effects. One in the US, and it's actually helpfully called nudge versus learning, and also found very little effect in the longer term. And the other one is from Ethiopia, also finding very little effect in the second year.
Fantastic, thank you, Julia. And happy to pass the floor over to Wofai again, who has a colleague's question from Somalia.
Yes, this is a very interesting one, just like the other questions. And I think it'll be great for Mick and Julia to on this one. It says, we plan to implement taxation based on assessments in Somalia, and tax compliance is an important component of these studies. Taking into account the fragility of the Somalia context, what would you advise to focus on? Over to you both.
Well, I'm going to have to. I'd say I need to know. I need to learn a lot more about Somalia than I do at the moment, sadly. But I think if we're talking about the sort of the relatively quick revenue raises in difficult situations, the emphasis in the old days for that used to be on customs as a source of revenue. I think the source that I'm not sure how much is used already in Somalia, but it gets more attention these days are various things related to telecoms, purchase of cards, mobile phones, all those kind of things. But I think if we're talking about I think I'd need to know a little bit more about Somalia to know what the constraints are. But I think thinking has changed a little bit about what the easiest revenue handles are in different circumstances. But I'll leave it there and see what you say.
First of all, thanks a lot for that question. I think I was just by a few days ago speaking with a colleague from the Ministry of Finance from Somalia, and I just realized how big are the challenges in particular context and in all fragile contexts, which makes it very, very hard to answer the question in any way that is really complete or fully sensible. But I think there are, and I also don't know Somalia very much or at all, so I'm not going to weigh in and then try to give a complete answer. But there are three things that I think one might want to think about. The first one is in a context where there is not much about the tax system. I guess one of the first things is figuring out, what are the immediate problems that can be sort of quickly fixed, and maybe start from something that is manageable, because I'm sure there are also bigger challenges. And in the specific case of Somalia, what I understand from colleagues is, there's also subnational levels of government that interact and coexist, and what the implications are for that on the tax system. So how those different systems maybe even duplicate the tax burden on taxpayers. I think this is quite important to understand before we touches the national system. And I guess in the same spirit of sort of figuring out what is it that is going on the ground before actually doing anything else. In many places, actually, there's there might not be a very organized system of tax administration as we think about it in higher income countries, but local governments need revenue, and they collect this kind of revenue in various ways. So there's a role for traditional leaders. There's of what we call informal taxation. And I think learning from those experiences is quite important. And this is not my domain at all. Some of my colleagues at the ICTD have worked a lot on this, including in Somalia and in the Horn region. So again, maybe there might be lessons there also for the formal tax system from those informal systems of revenue collection.
Thank you, Julia, and thank you to our colleague from Somalia for such an interesting question. Unfortunately, the bad news is our time is up. I know I could certainly listen to this conversation a lot longer. The good news is our panelists will be back. They'll be back on December 6th at 10:30 a.m. Washington, D.C. time. Please save the date. And at that time on December 6th, we'll be recording part 2 of our From the Lab to the Field series. Time we'll be discussing chasing tax ghosts. Julia and Mick will return, and we will also be joined by Munawar Sultan, who is a Tarat assessor and an international tax consultant. And this episode will be moderated by my FID colleague, Chris Thomas. So please save the date. I'd like to thank Julia very much for your intervention today. Very insightful.
Thank you.
And Mick, it's always a pleasure to have you on the podcast. Thanks again for coming out of retirement for us today. Great insights.
Thanks so much for asking me.
Great. If you'd like to find out more information about research, please look below this video for the links to her research, and we'll also have a link to Mick's book for some entertaining reading. Again, and until next time.